I go. Right. Wenn ihr wüsstet, wie schwierig es war, hierhin anzukommen. That's a different matter. Okay, anyway. I'm going to talk about the civic city in a nomadic world. Und wenn man das auf Deutsch übersetzt, klingt es ein bisschen nicht das gleiche wie im Englischen, Stadt der Bürger. In English it sort of means to be involved in your city in various ways. And what I'm really interested in is that fracture. This is the cover of the book, which will come out next week, and I'm interested in that fracture there, because I think that is one of the big things about the future, how that will resolve itself. Because, as we know, there's a fault line in many ways, you know, between the social and the tribal, things like that. There's a fracture in terms of populations who lead parallel lives. Okay, I'll speak louder. Sorry, of course, I went to bed at 3. Okay, can you hear me? Yes. Can you hear me? Yes, yes, yes. Okay, right. You got the first bit, yeah? A fracture. That was the main word, a fracture. This doesn't seem to want to work. It does. And the other point about it is really the fragility that creates because of all the escalating changes that are happening that we all experience and so on. What's the best way to position this? Because this isn't moving very quickly. Okay. So I think we all know we live in awkward times. The zeitgeist is one of anxiety. There's apprehension in the air. And in a way, many people would say the world is turning to its darker face. I'm finding this a bit difficult. Is this me who's not doing the right thing? Anyway, there was an urbanist who was a biologist 100 years ago who said the city is more than a place in space. It's a drama in time. And I think that's absolutely true today more than any other time that we are facing. I am really finding this difficult. Is this me? So the world obviously is in motion in various ways, and what I'm talking about is 4 themes. The world being in motion, the city being in motion, and then also what happens then when we try to create zones of encounter. Where are these encounters going to take place, and how are they going to take place, and how are we going to create places of empathy where difference meets, which of course is the essence of what a city is about. So let's look at this a bit more closely. I think the question that I think is interesting is that there is a return of the nomads. We started human civilization, obviously, as a nomadic tribe. These people happen to be in Sydney Art Gallery, but they're a version of a return of the nomads. And you can see that in all sorts of senses. This is Berlin, of course. This is a nomad. I just saw him in the metro. He happened to be, I don't know if he is going to Vienna, Stockholm, or wherever. That guy playing the music, and so on. And I think this is a world that many of you will obviously be in yourself. For example, you know, you're working like that. This happens to be in Istanbul, and I quite like the idea that it says hype, because there's obviously a lot of hype about that. But one of the questions really that arises that is really quite substantial is the question of rootedness. I mean, how rooted are we in a place? And if this would only work, you would see that. So this guy, for example, I just saw in Vancouver. He was just standing somewhere. And you know, in photography, you often are lucky. I was just lucky that he had a bag that said roots there to sort of remind me of the fact that this is what tends to happen. Now, sorry, this is not going like the flow. You know what I want to do is I want to flow like a piece of music, and I'm not flowing. And this thing, can we just look at this? If this, shall I go here? 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 Okay, I'll do that. I can't see you. but you can get the general idea. So I'll work from here. So everybody knows the way that new third spaces are developing and so on. And that's all absolutely fine. People are moving. Talent is obviously moving to the bigger cities, as we know. There are then, therefore, shrinking cities. The question is, will these people come back? But the other movement, of course, particularly if you're in the Middle East, this is Dubai, is the movement of people who are workers. You could call them slaves or whatever. And of course, again, the movement of refugees who represent 80 million of the 1 billion people who are on the move at the moment. So given that there are 7 billion people in the world and 1 billion are in constant movement, you can see that this changes our conception of place and space. The other point is to do with the mass of people. This is UN Habitat's thing about cities in Quito, and when I was born, there were 2.3 billion people in the world. Now there are 7.3 billion. Now I don't have to talk about climate change to know that each individual's footprint is vast. I'm not saying we kill everybody or euthanasia. I'm just saying this is about education, because the countries that have limited their population growth, Iran is the best, believe it or not, are ones that educate women. Now, given that the biggest growth in population in the world is going to be in Africa, 1.4 billion more people in the next 35 years. Can you imagine what it's going to be like on the border of Libya if we don't develop those countries, if we don't empower women, which is the main way that population is limited in some way? We're in a dramatic crisis. Enough of the negative, sorry. Okay, the next thing is that, of course, within that movement, more things are moving faster and faster. For example, people walk now roughly 20% faster as they did before in cities. Singapore is the main place where people are walking faster. People eat faster. Hong Kong is the fast eating place, and quite often you can find restaurants where you go there, you pay according to the time you sit on the table, not what the meal was. So you can see all these things to do with time. Also, Zifferblatt, the cafe coming out of Moscow, is also a time-based thing. So what's really happening is a real transformation of, in a sense, place, space, and with the anytime, anywhere phenomenon. The other thing that's moving, of course, is citizenship. We always think that citizenship is the anchor of what we are. I am a citizen of whatever, Germany. Well, you can now buy citizenship. The cheapest is in Cyprus, $100,000, Dominican Republic, $100,000. There was recently a billionaire in China who escaped from Beijing. He had 11 passports. So all I'm really trying to emphasize all the time is this question of movement. And of course, the issue that enables that most strongly is the movement of capital. And there are lots of systems, as you know, which move capital around in nanoseconds, which is enabling that. One particular force that is good and bad, and you can see that in the riots, the anti-tourist riots all over the Mediterranean, is the question of tourism. And, you know, we often think, oh, tourism is so different, it's all diverse, this world that is, you know, I'm having so many experiences. Look at these buses, they're all the same. They're all the same, and they're all over the world. I think they're in most continents or something like that. The other thing, of course, our brands are moving. 30 million outlets of Coca-Cola in the world, 37,000 McDonald's. The other thing that is moving is, of course, crime. Crime is one of the speediest things. My web designer, talking about design, was hacked the other day. He was trying to get it controlled and all of that. It was started in Russia. In 4 hours later, he had seen it had gone to India, Egypt, and ended up in the States before that particular hacking thing had stopped. So that was within 4 hours. Somebody in the dark web just moving around. And of course, pollution is moving, as we well know. You see more people in masks in Beijing than anywhere else. But perhaps the most important, because we're here in the Cyberobic Center, is realities. Virtual reality, of course, has only just begun. And, you know, some people, as it says here, spend more minutes of their time in virtual worlds than outside. Whether that's good or bad is a different matter, but that is one of the big trends. And of course, the digital is incredibly immersive, as you know. You know the way of swiping screens and all that triggers dopamine. Dopamine is, of course, the thing that relates to heroin, which is very addictive. So just as we're looking at this, I'm not being negative, but I'm just pointing out there are some deeper features going on that are determining these things. And of course, it's a massive breakthrough. You all know that. You work in those fields yourself. And of course, some of the monopoly companies like Google, again, good and bad, but every time we go yes to a cookie, then someone knows a tiny bit more about us, which is why you obviously probably know about the My Data movement. So we can't hide from big data, which is, of course, one of the enabling devices of the things that we are talking about. And when the biggest hotel chain in the world is Airbnb without any hotel rooms, and I know the Berlin situation on that, or when the biggest taxi company in the world with no taxis owning them themselves is Uber, and when the biggest media provider in the world is Facebook, that doesn't actually provide its own media channel itself, you know, obviously the world has changed and we're living in it, etc., etc. Nothing to say. Enabled, of course, through a very small device, the mobile phone. Now, the issue then is, as we come into cities, is the question of how we are coming together in which context, and whether we are leading parallel lives, and whether that matters. In some sense, it doesn't matter. In Jerusalem here, you know, if you've ever been to Jerusalem, you know how tense the situation is. I would say it does matter. Does it matter here in Penang, in this video shop, when different religions come together and have different fundamental views of life? If there is some sort of sense of joint acceptance according to certain principles, of course all that difference is absolutely fine. But one thing I think is completely neglected is the psychological impact of that. I'm not all saying we should go to the psychotherapist, I'm not saying that, I'm just saying we need to be aware that this is a massive psychological adjustment which goes through the generations. It's not only old people who have this problem of adjustment, many other age groups have the adjustment problem as well. And of course, in general, one could say it is very exciting. But others, of course, it's threatening. And that's why I think, if you think of the Brexit phenomenon, Trump, I don't want to mention the other things here as well, is one of the main reasons why this flashback is coming, this fight back between some people, you know, Trump says the patriots, good, the globalists bad, as if one couldn't be a bit patriotic and a global-oriented person at the same time. So that's what I mean by the fracture. That's just one of the fractures. Now, in other words, we're in the midst of redesigning the world and all its systems, economically, legally, politically, socially, culturally, and so on. And the question is, what is that vision? Is, in all of this, the human being going to be put center stage? Now, easy to say these words, of course these words are very easy to say, but in the end it's about, you know, policies, laws and all of that that do that. This is obviously after the Paris outrages in Antwerp, and is a very good version of using the digital in a sense to send through a message of solidarity or whatever. Now that means for me this question of the civic is really important, and that refocuses, in my view, I mean, obviously when I wrote The Creative City in the late 80s, blah-de-blah, I talked about the sort of creativity you're talking about. I'm still interested in it, but I think there's a much bigger game to play, and I think civic creativity, which I talked about a lot for years and nobody's really interested in, is, I think, one of the key issues that we need to really be thinking about. Social innovations, all these other forms of innovations that deal ultimately with what I'm calling the fracture. That in civic creativity, in a sense, is about giving something back to the place you're in rather than being purely self-centered. It's the me, we point. Now, obviously we know, people use heavy words like community. I think that community is made up of many, many millions, thousands of tiny little things that then ultimately build up into things so that you feel your Keats is a Keats or whatever. And I remember meeting this woman in Frankfurt Airport. I was a bit sort of like this. She was called Shanana, I think. And so in the end, I did hug her. And broadly, I felt okay. I felt okay enough to take a photo and show it to you here. So she, in a sense, and it was appropriate that this was at the airport, was actually doing that. So these are the tiny little stepping stones that build things up. But you can see it more dramatically. This is hip-hop. This is in a favela in Bogota. And these guys, they're amazing. I got them to come over to Germany. Actually are into intergenerational understanding. So getting 45-year-old women to do hip-hop or 60-year-old guys is quite an interesting thing in a favela, which, as you can imagine, is pretty tense. Or take another example, which is here in Bologna, whose civic strategy, if I can call it, they have a big project called Immaginazione Civica, which obviously means the civic imagination. And they have redefined the city as a commons. I think many of you will know about the whole notion of urban commons. Urban commons is something between owning, sharing, managing between the public and private, rather than having the private so interesting, the public so boring. It's a sort of co-creation process in the middle. And they have a regulation called the Bologna Regulation, which is about anchoring in the joint management of lots of things that you see around in the city. So that's an example of a place that's thinking ahead and being progressive. Here's another example, which is Medellin, which you know was the murder capital of the world and has been dramatically transformed. And simply by inserting escalators through the hills, through the favelas, and then having young women, interestingly enough, at each point there being the guardians of safety, has completely transformed a place which you wouldn't even dare go in. But obviously you can also get up and down and so on, because otherwise I couldn't take those photos had I not been in there. So these are just examples, like even this one. This is Helsinki, the world design capital. Many of you will know this, the Chapel of Silence, which is a combination organized by the Social Services Department and the Lutheran Church. But it's not about religion. It's about actually calming down. Now, of course, everybody knows about mindfulness, which is completely the wrong word. Anyone who knows about all of that will know it's mind emptiness, not fullness. The last thing you bloody want is a full mind when you're trying to de-stress yourself. But anyway, these are sort of urban examples of things that are happening that could happen in a much wider way. And obviously, you know the interesting way your metro has all those different signals and symbols there. So what does that leave us? In cities and places, beyond needing a job, there are probably 5 constants. People want anchorage, they want possibility, connection, some sort of aspiration to do better, and inspiration. So dealing with memory, history, tradition is incredibly important for people to have it in some way, even though sometimes that history is difficult. Then the question of possibility. Places that work well are places where people feel they can be more than they are. They have choices, options, they can grow, job opportunities, and obviously Berlin is one of these hubs. So, and that is, of course, the essence of cities. So, you know, obviously there would be more interesting if cities were a bit more playful, but that's a different topic. And then that question of doing more than you want to be, you know, can be festivalization, it can be all of those things, but many others. It can just be learning a new discipline. But one of the most important things is really this question of inspiration. And historically, inspiration, of course, for many people would be the church and so, and some people talk about galleries and museums as, what do they say, the cathedrals of the post-industrial age. This happens to be a library in Rio de Janeiro. But which I believe is inspirational. And so finding and creating places of inspiration to lift you out of, in a sense, the dullness of the traffic jam is incredibly important in driving human emotions, which is why I keep on talking about psychology here. Because ultimately what it's about is that question of identity. And of course, we don't have one fixed identity. The classic Trumpites find that rather difficult to absorb, that we are different things at different moments, and that melange is the thing that makes us what we are. Now, cities aren't really the sort of thing I'm talking about. I just gave you examples that I think are good. And so what you find is more and more resistance. When I did the talk to open the Holzmarkt, down the road, we had a big session which was called The Relevance of Resistance. How resistance in Berlin, with its anarchic streak and its bit of mürrishness, which is a pain in the neck, but nevertheless, is one of these places where obviously resistance can sometimes be incredibly productive, because the basic problem at any city, any place that is interesting is the dilemma of this, which is Zurich West. You see that hotel moving into an old quarter, the Renaissance Hotel. The one person who was left who had a building was an artist who put resistance. Now, finding that interesting balance between development and gentrification and not letting the critical mass flip over is quite important, which is why things like Bissim's Kies, is that project in Kreuzberg, is obviously one of the many, many responses we see in the world. So I'm just going to wrap up, basically. So the key question in all of this, and this is again one of these dilemmas, fault lines, is the good cities with those good things I'm talking about that collaborate across borders and boundaries requires openness. And many people, of course, don't like openness. And what it requires for cities is to have experimentation zones, living labs, and all of that. Many of these things, indeed, you have here in Berlin. But one of the main things is really, how do you reinvent democracy? Because we're moving, at least in certain countries, from representative democracy, some idea that somewhere you vote for someone every 4 years, to participative democracy. And that, for the bureaucracy, and the German bureaucracy, as we know, is heavy, very heavy, pretty heavy. That's fine, but it's perhaps too heavy. For them to adjust to those movements in the democratic process. And that really requires a degree of tenacity, you could call it courage, whatever you want to do that. But the easiest way to say it is a Berlin or any other city represented here should move from a no because culture. So often you're facing these institutions and they say, you can't do that because, to yes if. And the world that I think we're trying to get to, which is more co-creative, more working together, collaborative, cross-fertilizing and all of that, is a sort of culture, easy to say again, that is more about yes if than no because. And that requires people across borders and boundaries communicating with each other. This is just one final, more or less thing, is in the past when we planned, we always planned in an idea of the known, predict and provide. We will build 1 kilometer of asphalt, boom, in 1 year, boom. But where we need to be, I think, is something which I would call elastic planning. And the key thing that anchors it is that we're strategically principled and tactically flexible. We know where we're going, 3 big ideas, whatever those are, that's the direction, the journey of travel. But in order to get there, because the world is moving, things are not straightforward, we have to be tactically flexible, but it keeps us anchored through those principles. So just to wrap up, if you put all of this together and look at everything in cities, you could say there are sort of 10 things that cities need to focus on. And I'm calling that, anyway, let's call it the new urbanity or something. And the first is, as I've implied, is integrated thinking, planning, and acting. Easy to say, but thinking holistically is bloody difficult. And training and education, the Spartendenken, all of that stuff, doesn't allow you to really think horizontally. And to get people who can think horizontally, and I think statistically there are more horizontalists here than verticalists, is not easy. So that's point one. Point two is, how do you maintain that shared commons, which is back to my point about the urban commons and stuff like that. And that requires a completely new trusting relationship when it's not to do with specific rules, das Gesetz, die Gesetzordnung or something like that. It's much more about, as I said, an approach, a principle, and so on. The third is this question of cultural literacy. In fact, having cities, and you can see cities, Bologna is a great city for this, which really encourages you to understand the other and connect with the other in some way. Nobody's saying we need to love each other. It's nothing to do with that. It's just, if we're in the same space, at least we've got sort of codes of behavior that respect each other. The third is, or the fourth, I've forgotten where I am, is intercultural or intergenerational understanding. There are so many things that people of 60 and 20 do like together. They all like sitting down on a bench and hanging out, yeah? They mostly like not necessarily beer or wine or something like that. There are a string of things that connect them. And the way capitalism unfortunately works, it segments and separates. The fifth is obviously eco-awareness. I don't need to say more. And then this question, this is Sao Paulo, this dramatic divide between rich and poor. One of the reasons for Brexit, of course, is neglecting the poor in the north of England. Older people voted for Brexit. On average, the life expectancy of the Brexit voter is 25 years less than the Remainer. So the Brexit old people have given a legacy to the young that they don't want. Yeah? Bloody amazing. Then, in planning, I just suggest you add one word: healthy. If all of our planning just always added the word healthy, does this plan make me healthy? The world may be a different place. And here, this is obviously a bit monotypish, is the idea of aesthetics in urban space is actually far too undervalued. And if you said to each developer, what aesthetic responsibility are you giving to this environment? You're chunking this soulless piece of stuff in, and just ask them that question. Are you creating a heritage for the future? Because what you're building is so bloody fantastic. I'd like to know what their answer is. And then, I don't want to talk about the creative city because, I wrote many books about that. But the essence of a 300-page book in one sentence is, when you are open, and how do you create the conditions in the world of dramatic change for people to think, plan, and act with imagination in solving problems and creating opportunities? And for me, personally, that is a key driver of everything we're talking about. But it also means this new democracy, which is a democracy within a digital world, which means it will be different. The way we interact with entities and so on, I don't need to tell you, is completely different. And what that means is, it's a lovely piece of Russian art, just by the way, Misha Bulgakov, is changing some regulations and incentives. So there we are, coming together at some way in different ways. Now my conclusion is, because a lot of stuff about cities is about the physical, the hardware approach to city making. But this word, these 5 words, have taken me 35 years to work out. The soft is the hard. The soft stuff is really, really, really hard. And that's the message I want to leave with you. It's not about money, it's about mindset. It's understanding how the soft works. Okay, thanks.